The letter on the Duke's writing table demanded £11,000 before the spring, and Corwin Vailcrest had read it so many times that the ink had begun to blur. Outside the tall windows of Aurelian House, the Celestine sea threw itself against the cliffs of Thornmere Reach with the patience of something that knew it would win. He folded the letter once, then again, and reached for the marriage contract that lay beside it. One document threatened to take everything his ancestors had built. The other promised to save it, provided he was willing to sell the last thing he still owned outright, which was his own name. "You need not look as though you are signing your execution," said Mr. Aldous Penhallow, the solicitor who had arranged the match. He stood near the cold hearth, hat in hand, watching the Duke the way a man watches weather. "The lady is sensible. She asks for protection and a roof. You ask for her dowry and a son in due course. There is a clean honesty in such bargains, Your Grace. Cleaner, I should say, than most love." "I have no quarrel with honesty," Corwin answered. "I have a quarrel with strangers." "Then it is fortunate you need not love her, only marry her." The Duke dipped his pen and signed. The scratch of it seemed very loud in the great quiet room, where the painted faces of dead Vailcrests looked down from the walls in their gilded frames, each one stern, each one watching, as though they too were creditors waiting to be paid. Seraphine Marroway arrived 3 days later, in the grey hour before a storm. She came in a hired carriage with a single trunk and no maid, and when she stepped down onto the gravel, she did not gape at the towers of Aurelian House the way most visitors did. She looked instead at the cliffs and at the dark line of the sea beyond them, and something passed across her face that Corwin, watching from the steps, could not name. It was not awe. It was closer to recognition, as though she had returned to a place she had been told of all her life and had never quite believed in. "Your Grace," she said, and curtsied with a composure that surprised him. She was 24, slight, with dark hair pinned plainly, and grey eyes that met his without flinching. She was not the timid creature Penhallow had described. "I am grateful for your hospitality. I shall try to give you little trouble." "Trouble is a luxury this house cannot afford," Corwin said. "We understand one another then. Separate apartments, separate hours. A respectable face for the world and nothing demanded behind it." "Nothing," she agreed. And yet her hand, he noticed, tightened on the strap of her reticule, as though it held something she did not mean to surrender. They were married within the fortnight, in the small grey chapel at the edge of the estate, with Penhallow and 2 servants for witnesses. The vows were spoken plainly and meant plainly, which is to say they were promises made to a contract rather than to a person. When Corwin placed the thin band on her finger, Seraphine's hand was steady, but her eyes were fixed on the chapel's far wall, where a single stained window let in the stormlight, and she seemed to be listening for something that did not come. For a fortnight after, they lived as agreed, 2 strangers under one ancient roof. He rode the estate by day, meeting with tenants whose rents could not stretch to meet his debts. She walked the gardens and the long galleries, and the servants reported with cautious approval that the new Duchess asked clever questions about the house and never once complained. He told himself he was relieved by her distance. He did not examine why he found himself listening for her step in the corridor, nor why the great rooms felt less like a tomb when she was somewhere within them. It was Lady Honoria who insisted upon the portrait. She was Corwin's great-aunt by marriage, near 80, a small, fierce woman who had outlived 3 Vailcrest dukes and intended to outlive a 4th out of sheer disapproval. She arrived from the dower house with her cane striking the floors like a magistrate's gavel, and she declared that a marriage was not a marriage until it hung upon the wall. "Every duchess of this house has sat for the family portrait," she said over dinner, her eyes moving across Seraphine with the patience of a hawk. "It is the one thing your father could not mortgage, Corwin. The line itself. Let the girl take her place in it." "There is no money for a painter," Corwin said. "There is the old painting," said Lady Honoria. The great one in the long gallery, the one your grandfather hung and your father turned to the wall. A new likeness can be added to it. The painter Brennick still lives in the village, half-blind and wholly cheap. It is fitting. Let the new bride join the old blood. Corwin saw Seraphine's hand go still upon her glass. "Which painting?" she asked very quietly. "The great Valcrest portrait," Lady Honoria said. "3 generations gathered upon the cliff, painted in the year 58, near 60 years past now. A monstrous thing, but it is ours." She smiled without warmth. "You will like it, child. There are so many faces in it that one more will hardly be noticed." That night Corwin could not sleep. He told himself it was the debts. He did not let himself believe it was the look on his wife's face when the painting had been named, a look like a door opening onto a room she had sworn never to enter. The long gallery had been kept shut for years, and the servants had to force the doors. Within, the air was cold and smelled of dust and linseed and the sea. At the far end, beneath a shrouded cloth, the great portrait waited. When the cloth was drawn away, even Corwin, who had not looked at it since boyhood, felt the breath leave him. It was enormous, taller than a man and 3 times as wide. Upon the painted cliff stood the Vela crests of 60 years past, in their silks and powder, the sea behind them silver and endless. There was his great-grandfather in the centre, severe and proud. There were sons and daughters arranged about him like a court. And in the foreground sat the painter Brennick now, a wisp of an old man with milky eyes and steady hands, ready to add the Duke and his new Duchess to the scene, 2 living faces among the dead. Seraphine entered last. She walked the length of the gallery slowly, her steps echoing, and Corwin watched her rather than the painting. He saw the moment her eyes found the canvas. He saw her gaze move across the proud central figures with no more than polite interest. And then he saw it stop. It stopped upon a figure at the very edge of the painted crowd, half turned away, a young woman in a pale gown, standing apart from the others near the cliff's edge. Time and damp had faded her almost to a ghost. Her face was a smear of cracked paint, her gown a paleness, her hand lifted as though she were about to wave or to fall. She had been pushed to the margin of the picture as though the painter, or someone after him, had wished her gone. Seraphine made a small sound. It was not a word. Her face lost its colour all at once, the way water loses light when a cloud passes, and her hand rose to her throat. She took 1 step backward and another, and then her knees gave way beneath her, and she fell. Corwin caught her before she struck the floor. She was light in his arms, far too light, and for a terrible instant her eyes were open and seeing nothing. Then they cleared and found his face, and filled with something that frightened him more than her fainting had. It was not confusion, it was grief, raw and old, and entirely without surprise. "Who is she?" Seraphine whispered, her gaze dragging back toward the faded figure on the canvas. "The woman at the edge. Tell me who she is." "I do not know," Corwin said, and it was the truth. "I have never known." Lady Honoria stood very still at the gallery's end, her cane silent for once, her old face the colour of ash. "No one," the old woman said. "She is no one. The damp has ruined that corner, that is all. Take the girl to her rooms, she is overtired." But that night, after the physician had been and gone, and pronounced the Duchess merely faint with the cold of the gallery, Corwin could not let it rest. He went back to the long gallery alone with a lamp, and he stood before the painting for a long time, looking at the woman at the edge whom no one was, and he saw, when he lifted the lamp close, that her face had not faded by accident. Someone had scraped it, deliberately, with something narrow and sharp again and again, until there was nothing left to know her by. In the morning he found Seraphine already awake, seated by her window with the sea beyond her, and a small object cupped in both her hands. When she saw him in the doorway, she closed her fingers over it, but not before he had glimpsed it. A miniature, a portrait the size of a coin, in an old worn frame. "You knew her," Corwin said. "The woman in the painting. You knew her face before you ever entered this house." For a long moment Seraphine said nothing. Then she opened her hands and held out the miniature, and Corwin crossed the room and took it. The painted face within was young, perhaps 18, with dark hair and grey eyes, and a particular tilt to the chin that he had seen that very week across a chapel and a dinner table. It was the face of the woman at the edge of the great portrait. It was also, unmistakably, a version of the woman seated before him now. "Her name was Isabeau Vallecrest," Seraphine said. "She was my grandmother, and she was driven out of this house 60 years ago for a crime she did not commit." The room seemed to tilt. Corwin set the miniature down with great care because his hand was not steady. "Valcrest," he repeated, "you bear that blood." "I bear it, and I have hidden it," she said. "That is the secret I swore to keep. My grandmother made me swear it on her deathbed last winter. She had grown so small by the end, Your Grace, a woman who was born in this house who should have been a daughter of it, and she died in 2 cold rooms in a market town with a borrowed name." Seraphine's voice did not break, but it cost her not to break it. "She told me everything. And then she asked one thing of me, to come back, to find the truth she was robbed of, to make this house remember her face before they finished scraping it away. And so you married me," Corwin said slowly, "to gain the house. I married you because a man named Penhallow was seeking a quiet bride with a small dowry, and my grandmother's solicitor was his cousin, and the door opened and I walked through it." She lifted her chin, the very tilt the miniature wore. "I will not pretend it was chance. You would not believe me, and I would be lying. But I never meant you harm. I only meant to come home to a home that was never given me." Corwin stood very still. Within him 2 feelings warred, and he could not tell which was the stronger. One was anger, cold and immediate, the anger of a man who had been chosen the way a tool is chosen. The other was a strange and unwelcome tenderness, for the woman before him had carried this grief into his house alone, and borne his coldness, and asked him for nothing. "You should have told me," he said at last. "And you would have turned me out before the ink was dry," she answered. "You needed a bride who wanted nothing. I let you believe I was she." He could not deny it. He turned to the window and looked out at the sea, and for a long while neither of them spoke. "What was the crime?" he asked finally. "The crime she did not commit." "Theft," said Seraphine. "They said she stole the Valcrest sapphires, a great parure sapphires and diamonds, the dearest thing the family owned. They said she took them and fled in the night, with a man beneath her station, a music master she had fallen in love with. Her brother, your grandfather, swore it before the magistrate. She was disinherited, her name struck from the family book, her face scraped from the painting. She fled with nothing but the clothes she wore and the child she would bear that winter. My mother." Seraphine's grey eyes burned. "She never touched those jewels, Your Grace. She told me so as she was dying, and a dying woman does not lie for vanity. She loved the music master. That was her only crime. The theft was a tale told to disgrace her, so that her portion of the estate might never be claimed." Corwin thought of the £11,000. He thought of the debts that had haunted his family for 60 years, debts his father had drowned in, debts no one had ever fully explained. "If she never took the sapphires," he said slowly, "then where did they go?" Seraphine looked at him, and for the first time since she had entered his house, the wariness in her face gave way to something open. "That," she said, "is what I came here to learn." From that morning, the marriage of convenience quietly ceased to be one. They did not speak of it. There was no scene, no avowal, no sudden tenderness across a candlelit table. There was only the work, and the work drew them together as nothing tender could have. By day, Corwin met his stewards and held his creditors at bay. By night, he and Seraphine searched the house, room by shuttered room, for the truth of Isabeau Valcrest. They read old letters by lamplight until their eyes ached. They prized open chests that had not been opened since the dead king's reign. Seraphine, it turned out, had a quick and ruthless mind, the kind that fit facts together the way a locksmith fits a key, and Corwin found that he looked forward to the hours after dark more than he had looked forward to anything in years. He learned that she laughed rarely, but that when she did it transformed her whole grave face. He learned that she took her tea too strong and read until dawn, and was afraid, beneath all her composure, of being sent away from yet another place that should have been hers. "You need not fear that," he told her once in the small hours, both of them seated upon the floor of the muniment room amid a sea of old deeds. "Need I not?" She did not look up from the page she held. "You married a quiet bride who wanted nothing, your grace. You have instead a Valcrest with a grievance and a claim. Most men would already have written to the lawyers." "I am not most men," Corwin said, "and you might cease calling me your grace, since you are my wife, and since we are sitting upon a floor at 3 in the morning covered in dust." For an instant her composure faltered. "What shall I call you then?" "My name," he said. "I find I should like to hear it in your voice." She looked at him then, truly looked, and the lamp made gold of the dust between them. "Corwin," she said, as though testing the weight of it. And he understood with a quiet shock that the bargain he had signed to save his house had become the only thing in it he did not wish to lose. But the truth, when they found its trail, did not lie quiet. It was Lady Honoria who stood in their way. The old woman watched their searching with growing alarm, and one evening she summoned Corwin alone to the dower house and told him plainly to stop. "You will leave the dead in peace," she said, her ringed hands trembling on her cane. "There is nothing in that old scandal but grief, and grief does not pay debts. The girl is using you, Corwin. She has wormed her way into your name, and now she means to dig up the foundations of this house and call the ruin justice. Send her away while you still have a house to keep." "What do you know of it?" Corwin asked very quietly. "You were here. You were a young bride yourself in the year 58. You knew Isabeau." The old woman's face worked. For a moment he thought she would deny it. Then something in her crumpled, some long-held strength giving way at last. "I knew her," Lady Honoria whispered. "She was the kindest of all of them, and the brightest, and they destroyed her for loving a poor man. I held my tongue for 60 years because I was afraid of your grandfather while he lived, and afraid after of what the truth would do to all of us." She looked up, and her old eyes were wet. "I was there the night she fled, Corwin. I saw her go, and I have never told a living soul what I saw her do before she went." Corwin knelt before her chair. "Tell me now." "She went into the long gallery," said Lady Honoria. "Alone, in the dark, with the whole house against her. I followed her and watched from the door. She did not weep. She stood before the great portrait, before her own painted face, and she lifted her hand to it. And then she did something to the frame. I could not see what. I thought in my fear that she was bidding the painting farewell. I have thought it for 60 years. The old woman's voice dropped to nothing. But she was not bidding it farewell. She was leaving something behind. Corwin was on his feet and running before she had finished. He found Seraphine in the gallery already, as though some thread between them had drawn her there at the same hour. She stood before the great portrait, with a lamp lifted to the faded figure of her grandmother, and she turned when he entered, her eyes wide. "Corwin, look," she said. "Look at the frame, just here, beside her hand. It is not the same as the rest." He came to her side and held the lamp close. The great frame was a thing of carved and gilded wood, vast and ornate, and most of it was solid as a wall. But there, beside the painted figure of Isabeau, at the very edge where her ghostly hand was raised, one carved panel of the frame sat a hair's breadth proud of the rest, as though it had been opened once and never quite closed. Corwin pressed it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a small, dry click that sounded across 60 years, the panel swung inward, and a narrow hollow opened in the body of the frame. Within lay two things. The first was a folded letter, the paper gone brown and brittle. The second, wrapped in a scrap of faded silk, was a weight of cold fire. Corwin drew it out and unwrapped it, and the lamplight broke into 1,000 blue and white sparks across his hand. The Vallecrest sapphires. The great parure that had been stolen 60 years ago by a woman who had never touched it, lay gleaming and whole in the very frame of the painting they had cut her from. Seraphine made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh, and pressed her hand to her mouth. "She hid them," Corwin said, hardly believing it. "She was accused of stealing them, and she hid them here in the house, where any honest searcher might find them, so that no one could ever truly say she had taken them away." "Read the letter," Seraphine whispered. "Read it aloud, I cannot." Corwin unfolded the brittle paper with great care, and by the lamp he read the words a frightened girl had written 60 years before. They were simple words. She wrote that she was leaving the jewels where they belonged, because she was no thief, though they would name her one. She wrote that she went freely for love and asked no part of the estate, only that her name be remembered with truth and not with lies. And she wrote, at the last, that she left these things for whatever child of hers might one day come home to claim, not the riches, but only the truth. When Corwin finished, there was a long silence in the gallery, broken only by the sea. "She knew," Seraphine said at last, her voice unsteady. "She knew that one day someone would come. She left it for me." She lifted her grey eyes to the faded face above them. "I came home, grandmother," she said softly. "I came home." Corwin set down the lamp and took his wife's hands in both of his, and the cold weight of the sapphires lay forgotten on the silk between them. "There is more truth here than her innocence," he said. "Do you not see it? If the sapphires were never sold, then they never paid a debt. The money that has haunted this house for 60 years, the debts my father drowned in, the debts that drove me to a marriage of convenience, none of it was ever Isabeau's doing. My grandfather built a lie to disgrace his sister and seize her portion, and he gambled and spent and ruined himself all the same, and blamed her ghost for it ever after." He shook his head slowly. "She did not take a single thing from this family. We took everything from her." "And now?" Seraphine asked. "Now," Corwin said. "Her name goes back into the family book, in ink, before the week is out. Her face is restored upon this wall by the steadiest hand in the county. And the sapphires she guarded so carefully will be sold honestly by me to pay the debts an honest woman never made." He drew a breath. "It will be enough, more than enough. She saved this house twice, once by hiding these, and once by sending you to find them." Seraphine's composure broke at last, all of it, 60 years of it, and she wept, and Corwin drew her against him and held her while she did, there beneath the cliff and the silver-painted sea, beneath the faded face of the woman who had brought them together across the length of 2 lives. It was Seraphine, much later, who spoke into the quiet. "You might still set me aside, you know," she said. "I came to you under a false face. I used your name to right my own wrong. A colder man would never forgive it." Corwin looked down at her, and for the first time in the memory of anyone at Aurelian House, the Duke of Thornmere Reach smiled without weariness in it. "I signed a contract for a wife who wanted nothing," he said. "I find I have been given one who wanted only the truth and a home, and the courage to ask for both. I cannot think when I have made a better bargain. I will not be setting it aside." He paused. "Unless, of course, you intend to keep calling me your Grace." And Seraphine laughed, the rare laugh that changed her whole grave face, and the sound of it filled the long gallery, where for 60 years there had been only dust and silence, and a woman scraped from a wall. The portrait was restored that winter. Old Brennick, half blind as he was, worked from the miniature and from the living face of the Duchess, and slowly, beneath his steady hand, Isabeau Vallecrest returned to her place upon the cliff. He moved her, at the Duke's instruction, from the faded margin to a place of honor near the center of her family, where the sea light fell upon her. And beside her, where 2 living faces had been meant to go, he painted Corwin and Seraphine, standing together, the grandmother and the granddaughter divided by 60 years, and joined at last upon one canvas, with the same dark hair and the same grey eyes and the same tilt of the chin. 7 autumns later, the long gallery was no longer kept shut. The doors stood open to the sea air, and the great portrait hung clean and bright at its end, and a small girl with dark hair ran the length of the floor as though it had been made for her feet alone. She was not yet 6, and she had been named Isabeau, and she stopped, as she always stopped, before the painted face she had been told was her own great-great-grandmother. And she pressed her small hand to the canvas, where a lady in a pale gown stood smiling near the cliff. "There you are," the child said, as she said every day to the woman in the painting. Corwin watched her from the gallery door, his hair gone a little grey now at the temples, the debts long since paid, and the house no longer a tomb. Beside him stood Seraphine, his wife, no longer reluctant and no longer hidden, a duchess in her own right and her own home at last. Through the open windows, the Celestine sea threw itself against the cliffs of Thornmere Reach with the same old patience, and the gulls cried, and the light came in silver across 3 generations of one family who had finally told the truth and found in the telling that they could love. "She speaks to her every day," Seraphine said softly, watching their daughter. "As you do," said Corwin, "as we all do." Seraphine slipped her hand into his, the way she had taken to doing, and they stood together and watched their child speak to the woman who had once been scraped from a wall, and who hung now in the light where she belonged. Some promises, Corwin had learned, are made in cold blood and meant to stay small, and some of them, against all the careful intentions of practical men, grow quietly into the whole of a life. If this story stayed with you, walk with me again to the cliffs of Thornmere Reach, where another forgotten secret is waiting for the next tale.